Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a seriously fascinating historical irony surrounding Vyacheslav Molotov. You probably know the name, right? Well, he was a prominent Soviet diplomat whose name accidentally got permanently stuck to two wildly different things. On one hand, you have the ultimate underdog's improvised weapon of resistance, and on the other, a massive, highly centralized economic strategy of a global empire. It's a classic David versus Goliath story packed with propaganda and geopolitical maneuvering. So let's jump right in.
Here is our agenda for today. We're going to start with the irony of the name itself. Then we'll look at the brutal Winter War, where the weapon was really perfected. After that, we'll break down the anatomy of the explosive, contrast it with the Soviet Union's Molotov plan, and finally explore its lasting echoes in modern conflicts. All right, Section 1. The Molotov Irony.
Okay, so the incredible irony here is that one of history's most universally recognized symbols of anti-authoritarian defiance was actually named after a major architect of authoritarianism. To see how that happened, we've got to rewind in 1939. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. And as Soviet bombers were just devastating Finnish areas, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov got on the radio to wage this massive propaganda war. Get this, he actually claimed to the world that these planes weren't dropping bombs at all. Nope, he said they were making humanitarian food deliveries for starving Finns. I mean, literally trying to spin a bombing campaign as a food drop.
And honestly, this brilliantly captures the Finns' incredible sense of dark humor in the face of total annihilation. First, they started sarcastically calling those devastating Soviet cluster bombs Molotov's breadbaskets. And then, when they started relying heavily on these improvised, bottle-based incendiary weapons to destroy Soviet tanks, they naturally dubbed their creation the Molotov cocktail. You know, they figured it was the absolutely perfect drink to pair with the foreign minister's alleged food. Just a brilliant bit of branding born out of sheer desperation.
Moving on to Section 2, the Winter War.
So, why did the Finns even need to devise such inventive, desperate defenses in the first place? Well, look at the sheer scale of the threat. The Soviet Union fully expected to conquer Finland in roughly 3 weeks. The Finns were massively outgunned and outnumbered, but they relied on this unique, deeply ingrained national ethos known as sisu. It translates roughly to pure guts or maybe chutzpah. It's this idea of extraordinary determination. They mobilized their entire nation, just flat out refusing to roll over. Individual soldiers found the sisu to literally face down armored tank columns on foot.
It was the ultimate Soviet Goliath versus the Finnish David. The Goliath was looking to aggressively expand its buffer zone to protect Leningrad and grab maritime control. But the Finnish David? They used their insanely harsh winter terrain to completely level the playing field. Finnish home guardsmen, who basically grew up on skis, would glide silently through these dense, freezing forests. They capitalized on the landscape's canalizing effects. Basically, the rough terrain forced the Soviet convoys into narrow, predictable single-file lines. This allowed the Finns to ambush them, strike hard, and just ski away into the woods before the Soviets even knew what hit them.
All right, Section 3, Anatomy of a Cocktail.
To really understand how the Finns fought back against heavy armor, we need to take a closer look at the anatomy of their famous improvised weapon. Now, the Molotov cocktail wasn't entirely invented in Finland. We actually saw similar devices pop up during the Spanish Civil War. But the Finns, they perfected it. The Finnish government actually started mass-producing these bombs in state-owned alcohol distilleries. The recipe was genius. They mixed alcohol and kerosene, but then added tar so the burning liquid would stick to whatever it hit. They also attached windproof matches, or sometimes chemical vials, right to the bottle to avoid the danger of pre-lighting a fuse. And get this, they intentionally left the bottle 1/3 empty. Why? So it would shatter way more easily on impact.
It is a true clash of asymmetries. Just picture this, a heavily armored Soviet T-26 tank going up against a cheap glass bottle. But those tanks had one fatal flaw, which was an air vent right on the back. A Finnish soldier would channel that sisu, sprint right up to this massive metal beast, and smash the cocktail against that rear vent. The burning, tar-thickened liquid would pour straight inside, smoking out the crew. And the second the Soviet soldiers popped a hatch to escape the fire, the Finns would be right there, waiting to engage them with submachine guns. It was incredibly dangerous, but highly effective.
And the real kicker here is that these brutal, localized tactics actually worked. The Finns inflicted horrific casualty levels on the Soviets and prevented a total defeat. When they signed the peace treaty in March 1940, Finland maintained its sovereignty as an independent state. They did lose 9% of their territory, which was a painful concession for sure, but keeping your independence against a global military superpower, that is an absolutely impressive achievement.
Now for Section 4, the Molotov Plan.
Let's shift gears for a minute, removing from the decentralized weapon of the underdog to a highly centralized economic tool of the empire. Fast forward on our timeline to the post-World War II era. By 1947, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe. But Molotov and the Soviet leadership looked at that and saw it as an explicit attempt by the US to buy influence and weaken Soviet control in Eastern Europe. So Molotov just outright rejected American aid, both for the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Instead, they formalized their very own economic countermove. And this countermove became known as the Molotov Plan. Internally, they called it the Brother Plan. It was basically a system of bilateral trade agreements designed to rebuild the Eastern Bloc entirely without Western reliance. But the deeper objective here? It was to adapt European economies to serve the USSR's specific needs. It worked like this. The Soviet Union would trade raw materials, things like grain, coal, cotton, and in exchange, they'd get manufactured goods and heavy equipment back from the Eastern Bloc. It effectively created a massive, closed economic loop.
When you look at the countries involved here, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, you really see the massive, centralized scale of this Soviet sphere of influence. This whole system later expanded into Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And it's such a stark juxtaposition, right? The Molotov cocktail was this localized, individual act of chaotic, desperate resistance. Meanwhile, the Molotov Plan was a sweeping, top-down instrument of total state control and economic integration.
But wait, there's yet another layer of historical irony here, what we can call the reparation contradiction. While the Soviets were using the Molotov Plan to supposedly provide aid and rebuild the Eastern Bloc, they were simultaneously extracting hundreds of millions of dollars in severe war reparations from former Axis members that were now sitting right inside that very same bloc. Countries like East Germany, Romania, Hungary, and yes, Finland were put on these incredibly punishing payment plans. The Soviet Union basically extracted around $900 million just to rebuild its own domestic economy, all while claiming to be the benefactor.
Let's move into our final section. Section 5, Echoes in Modern Conflicts.
Bringing this historical legacy full circle, it's wild to see how the tactics of the Molotov era continue to echo so powerfully in modern warfare. When sources compare the 1939 invasion of Finland to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, they note some really striking parallels in the playbook. We're talking massed forces on the border, protracted negotiations, and what the sources describe as manufactured pretext for invasion. Now, obviously the terrain is very different. The Finns fought in frozen, isolated forests, while Ukraine has fought heavily in dense urban city streets. And importantly, unlike the isolated Finns back in 1939, Ukraine has received vital, continuous military aid from the West.
Yeah, just to prove that history absolutely repeats itself. That improvisational spirit from 1939 reappeared almost instantly. Back in February 2022, as Russian forces were approaching Kyiv, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry officially tweeted out instructions urging everyday citizens to prepare Molotov cocktails. I mean, the Ukrainian General Staff literally posted tactical diagrams online. They showed people exactly where to aim these homemade incendiaries on Russian military vehicles, targeting their most vulnerable vents. It was a direct, incredible echo at the exact same Finnish strategy used against those T-26 tanks over 80 years ago.
Today, the Molotov cocktail carries a really complex legacy. Across the US and the European Union, it is strictly legally banned and criminalized because of its highly destructive nature. And make no mistake, it is incredibly deadly. According to the data, a Molotov actually packs about 15 times the energy of gunpowder. Despite the bans, it remains a persistent, almost universal feature in global uprisings. From the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia to civil unrest in Latin American nations like Chile and Colombia, protesters continually turn to it to deter heavily armed regime security forces. And that brings us to our conclusion. I want to leave you with this final, kind of mind-bending thought. In an era defined by precision drones, global cyber warfare, and hypersonic ballistic missiles, how is it that a primitive, century-old weapon continues to find such powerful relevance? Why does a simple glass bottle filled with flammable liquid remain the ultimate, universal symbol of the underdog's fight against overwhelming power? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.